So I'm sure most of you guys have seen this headline where they declare that Google search is dead. So yesterday, what happened was during Google's antitrust and DOJ investigation, Apple Eddie Q actually testified that he believed that Google search would be dead and that AI is actually taking over. And Apple also revealed plans that they are planning to integrate AI LLMs into Safari instead of Google. So there are multiple ways that you can actually look at this information. For me personally, I believe that the reason why Apple is shitting on Google is to make sure that they themselves do not get into a DOJ investigation. Because if the DOJ investigation concludes that Google is a monopoly, Apple will receive fines for aiding Google to become a monopoly. So therefore, what Apple is trying to do, in my opinion, is to actually downplay Google's search dominance and trying to downplay that Google has a monopoly by showing that there are a lot of competitors that are able to compete with Google. And I believe that this is the reason why he commented in such ways. So obviously, we cannot let sentiment drive our investing decisions. What we will have to do is to look at the fundamentals of the company. So first of all, let's look at the number of Apple iPhone units worldwide. We can see that we have around 1.5 billion people that are using iPhone products. So over here, 1.5 billion, let's say around 20% of them would switch into LLMs or Apple's AI. So in this situation, if 20% of them switch, that's around 300 million people. So honestly, I believe that the number of people that are switching into LLMs would not play a significant role into Google search business until later in the future, as we can see from this statistic over here. So as you can see from here, Google is retaining around 90% market share, and he has been retaining this actually across 10 years. So this data over here is across 2 years only, but across the 10 years, Google has maintained a 90% market share in the search engine business. Next, let's look at how Google makes money. So Google makes money from a variety of businesses. The majority comes from your search advertising, and then you have your YouTube, your Google Ad Network, your Pixel phones, and your Google Cloud business. So your search advertising is the one that is currently the bulk of the revenue, and search advertising is actually growing at around 10 to 12% every single year. Your Google Cloud business is growing at around 30% every single year. YouTube is growing at around 14% every single year. So let's look at Q1's 2025 income statement. As you can see, search advertising is around 50.7 billion, and you can see that the growth rates of Google is still continue to maintain at around 10%. So this is quite impressive. So over the years, over the 3 years that your ChatGPT has come out, Google's search revenue has not even decreased, and it has been increasing in line with the past at around 10 to 12%. Google grew 10% year over year, and your Google Cloud grew at 28%. So now let's look at my intrinsic value of Google currently. So if you look at the past, obviously the past is not a predictor of the future. However, it is a good representation of how the business would possibly do in the future. So in 2021, you see that there was a rapid spike in the earnings per share of the company, and this was due to COVID-19 as people transitioned into a digital world. However, you can see in 2022, it was down 20% for the earnings per share, and recently it has been growing quite steadily above 20%. So let's predict the future earnings per share growth of the company. So the earnings per share is made up of two things. The first thing is the change in the net income, as well as the change in the number of outstanding shares. So Google is actually known as a buyback machine, and it consistently buys back around 3% or 4% of its outstanding shares. So let's say our normal case scenario is extremely conservative. Google grows at only around 11% and it buys back at around 3 to 4%. So this means that the actual growth is probably around 8% or so. So with a fairly conservative valuation of 19 PE, we will get an intrinsic value of around $159. Let's look at the AI bull thesis. AI bull thesis is that Google regains its story as an AI dominant player, And we see its earnings per share grow at around 15% for the next 5 years, and then another 12% for the next 10 years. And we can have a higher multiple of around 26 PE. And we can see that Google's bull case will be around $265 intrinsic value. Let's look at the worst case scenario where your search gets effed and basically search is declining, but you still have other components of the businesses that are quite profitable. So the worst case where search actually gets screwed, right, is actually beneficial to Google in the long term, because in terms of the outstanding shares, because the price of Google stock will be depressed and management will be able to purchase it back at a better rate. So if you look at a 8% EPS growth over the long term, as well as a 18 PE terminal multiple, we will have Google's worst case scenario at around $120. So combining all of the different probabilities, we will get Google at an intrinsic value of around $161. And comparing to the stock price currently, which is around $154, it is slightly undervalued. So I believe that this overall intrinsic value calculation is actually quite conservative. And I believe that Google has a high chance of outperforming the markets in the long term if Google does not get broken up by the DOJ. So, of course, the DOJ is actually an uncertainty. And if you ask me, I would say that I believe that the DOJ would highly unlikely break up Google. I believe that the maximum that they would do is to basically fine Google and prevent Google from paying Apple the $20 billion every single year. So let's see how it progresses. And of course, I do wish that Google continues to drop. My next entry price will be at around $140. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found this useful.